This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, sex registrants, trust issues, and re-interviewing a witness. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. Welcome to episode number 87 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. And this week, I'm answering your questions about sex registrants, using third parties to help get a witness to give a statement, and whether scenes like a second witness interview should be cut from your story. Huge thanks to Gold Shield patrons Deborah Dunbar from DeborahDunbar.com, CC Jameson from CCJameson.com, Larry Keaton, Vicky Tharp of VickyTharp.com, Chris Ann, Larry Darter, Natalie Borelli of NatalieBorelli.com, Craig Kingsman of CraigKingsman.com, Lynn Vitale, Marco Carocari of MarcoCarocari.com, and Robert Mendenhall for their support, along with my Silver Cufflink and Coffee Club patrons. You can find links to all of the Bureau's patrons in the show notes at writersdetective.com/87. As I mentioned last episode, April's Patreon money was donated to Masks for Docs to provide PPE to those on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I will be doing it again in May. So if you have funds you'd like to donate, a box of N95 masks you'd like to get to those who need it most, or you're a first responder or medical professional that's in need of PPE, go to masksfordocs.com to get connected right now. And to learn more about patronage through Patreon, go to writersdetective.com/Patreon. Patreon. This week's first question comes from author L.K. Hill, who you can find at authorlkhill.com. And L.K. writes, "Good morning, Adam. This will be multifaceted. There is a 2007 Richard Gere film called The Flock. Kind of a B film, but my question concerns the premise. Gere is a retiring cop whose job it is to keep an eye on violent sex offenders in his area. The film deals with something they call domains, which are basically secret underground gathering places for sex offenders and those with strange fetishes, i.e. foot fetishes. Understand, this was largely for the rise of the dark web. We actually see foot fetish magazines in the film. But when I've tried to look up information on such things, my Google searches don't yield much. So my question is, are there really underground domains that police departments know about and keep an eye on? Would they be called something else? Or is this purely a construct of Hollywood? And if so, can you talk about how police departments keep eyes on known violent offenders in the area? Would detectives even know anything about them, barring them becoming involved in one of the detectives' cases? And if a child abduction happened and for any reason the police suspected a local sex offender might be involved, what would the procedure be? Thank you so much for all you do." Thank you so much, LK, and thank you for the questions. There's a lot to unpack here. Like you said, it's multifaceted. So let's start with the sex offender stuff first. In the United States, defendants that have been convicted of sex-related crimes are required to register as sex offenders. In California, Section 290 of the California Penal Code governs sex registrants, and we actually refer to these people as 290s. The most important aspect of being a registered sex offender came about in a 1995 to 1996 era amendment to the Federal Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. That amendment, which is more commonly known as Megan's Law, required law enforcement to make that sex offender registry available to the public, which you now know as the Megan's Law database. So on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, but depending on the crime or crimes the sex offender was convicted of, will change whether he has to register for life. And similarly, not all sex registrants are listed on the public-facing side of the Megan's Law database. The ones we're most concerned about, though, are definitely on the list for life, and the public can see that they are on the list. But if your arrest was for a misdemeanor like indecent exposure, then you'll only have to register for a minimum of 10 years. So if you're a sex registrant, you're on it for 10 years, 20 years, or you're on it for life, depending on the crime or crimes you're convicted of. Now, registration means going into your police department every year within 5 days of your birthday and getting your photo taken and confirming that there haven't been any changes to your address. If you're homeless, you actually have to do this every 30 days. And if you move, you have to do it within 5 days of moving. Oh, and as a quick aside, you won't see this on the database, but sex registrants are also required to provide their internet identifiers, in quotes. So that'd be their email addresses or their Instagram account names. But those won't be listed on the public side of the Megan's Law database, but as detectives, we get to see that information. Okay, so you get the idea about being a sex registrant. And by the way, there are registries for arsonists and narcotics abusers as well. So sex registrants aren't the only registrants out there. Just some food for thought on storyline ideas. Now, being a sex registrant is separate from being on probation or parole for that crime, or whatever new form of community supervision your area is calling it these days. And what I mean by this is the deal that you made to be released from custody, whether that's avoiding jail time altogether or being released from prison early or released from jail early. When this happens, you tend to waive certain rights, like your Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. In other words, the cops or probation or parole don't need a reason to come search you and your place because you waived those rights as part of that exchange for not being in custody anymore. Makes sense, right? If you don't want to waive your Fourth Amendment rights, you get to stay in jail. So when a sex registrant is on probation or parole, they're under supervision, which I assume is the role that Richard Gere was supposed to be playing as an agent of that vaguely named Department of Public Safety. Real life is that these probation officers and parole agents are so overworked that the term supervision is actually laughable. According to the Los Angeles County Probation's website, sex registrant probationers report to their PO monthly for a face-to-face meeting, and then they will also be seen once a month in the community, in quotes, by their probation officer. And all high-risk sex offenders are placed on GPS monitoring for the duration of their felony probation supervision. I'm not sure that a PO will actually see all of their probationers in the community, meaning at home or at work or whatever, once a month, because statistically, these POs are severely overworked, especially since the prison reform acts that have emptied our prisons and jails have put supervision squarely on the shoulders of county probation officers. But that's a topic for a whole other podcast episode. But knowing this is why Megan's Law is so important, allowing members of the public the chance to be aware of who is in their neighborhood. Now, the worst of the worst, SVPs, sexually violent predators, not only have GPS and regular meetings with their POs, but they will also have a private security officer present 24/7 to monitor the SVP's actions and to report any violations to police or probation. These guys are at the highest risk for recidivism, but for whatever reason, they've been released from prison, and having 24/7 security is part of their parole term. Well, at least until their parole expires. All of this is to answer your last two questions, LK, how police departments keep eyes on known violent offenders in their area, and whether detectives even know anything about them. We definitely know the registered sex offenders in our area, and we will actually go and do compliance checks on them as well. But it's tougher to keep tabs on what they're up to if they've paid their debt to society by serving their sentence and are no longer waiving their Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights. Kind of scary, but them's the rules of justice. Now, since I haven't seen the film, I'm not quite sure how the movie crafted these domains. The internet, and yes, specifically the dark web, has allowed fellow fetishists to connect like never before, especially when we're talking about things like child pornography, where the dark web is used to conduct business transactions, kind of like an illicit Amazon. But most sex crimes are actually about power and not so much about fetish, which also means the perpetrators need privacy, not a social circle. I'm sure there are underground gathering places for fetishists or fetishistas, fetishesians, like the velvet rope swingers in Eyes Wide Shut, or furries, or feet, or BDSM, or whatever your freaky jam is, most fetishes, especially ones with a social element, are usually not criminal. I mean, maybe if we're talking about the crimes of prostitution, but really these kinds of groups are far more likely to rent some mansion through VRBO or Airbnb for a night than they are to have some dungeon clubhouse somewhere. Because people talk, and moving your events make you a harder target for getting caught. If the cops did know about a domain, is what you called it, if they knew about it, they would shut it down. They would not let it continue. But even if that sexually violent guy did go to some underground event, he is undoubtedly going to stand out from the others in the fetish group, because there's freaky and then there's way over the top. And that's where they might get reported. Honestly, we see this phenomenon in all kinds of groups, like the quote-unquote direct action groups on both the far right and far left sides of the political spectrum that toe that criminality line. And then along comes this really aggro dude that wants to take it way further than everyone else in the group. You know, the guy that wants to blow up a building. He's going to stand out even in an extreme crowd. And even those extremists that might be anti-government or whatever, even those guys may be like, this guy's dangerous, we need to say something. I know, it's kind of crazy. So yeah, I'd venture a guess that the sex offender isn't going to fit in at the swingers event. Of course, that's pure speculation on my part, but I just don't see that really happening. Again, the stuff that sends you to prison, the stuff most sex registrants have been convicted of, really does require privacy. And to address LK's last question, albeit I took it out of order, sorry LK. The last question was, if a child abduction happened and for any reason the police suspected a local sex offender might be involved, what would the procedure be? If the sex offender was still on probation or parole, they could use that fourth waiver to search immediately. I'm sure they would check his GPS ankle monitor records to see if he was in the area of the abduction, as that would certainly be a factor. But if he wasn't on probation or parole anymore, he'd be treated like any other citizen for the most part. At the very least, I would have him under surveillance as soon as I had reasonable suspicion to believe he had any involvement in the abduction. And I'd certainly be adding his GPS info into my search warrant affidavit if it played a factor in believing he had a hand in the abduction. Now, of course, if it didn't, I would have to disclose that as well, because we have to disclose exculpatory evidence. And then I would also be looking at the crimes he's been convicted of in the past. So if the child matches the profile of this guy's prior victims, that may potentially help my argument in that search warrant as well. Sexually abusing a child is a very different thing from being dressed like a baby and wanting to be spanked. And before you go any further, just know that I spent way too much time working sex crimes and vice as a detective. All right. Thanks again for the questions, LK. You can find her work at authorlkhill.com. This week in the Facebook group, author Devlin Blake of devlinblake.com wrote, "So a known prostitute is brought in for questioning in regards to a murder. If she didn't do it, they're certain she's at least a witness. She refuses to talk, but she says she will to this one cop only. He lives in her building and she trusts him. How likely is it they'd have him talk to her? He's not a detective, he's a beat cop." Well, as a few others mentioned in the replies to Devlin's question in the Facebook group, the answer is yes, it would be likely. The key thing to understand in any investigation, especially a murder, is that the goal is to uncover the truth. If all I have to do is bring in someone the witness trusts in order to get me a potential treasure trove of leads or evidence, then hell yeah, I'm going to do it. And having that person be a police officer is even better. Detective is a rank and a job description. It means we do the follow-up work, as opposed to the patrol officer or the beat cop, as Devlin put it, that handles the initial response. But we all talk to people. We are all wearing a dozen hats, or helmets, as I like to say, at any given time. And the hat or helmet of interviewer, social worker, counselor, rock, confidant, protector, advocate, they're all in that toolbox, regardless of whether you're a detective or on patrol. We cannot force witnesses to talk to us, but having a witness that's willing to talk to anyone is a huge success that we don't want to squander. Chuck Hinckley asked, quick question. How do you feel about detectives going back to re-question a witness if something new comes to light? Is it too repetitive? Should we reveal all the first interview? I know it may happen in real life, but is it too repetitive in a book? I think I know what the answers will be, but curious what you have to say. I love this question, Chuck. This is 100% a craft question. And just as you alluded, I think you're right in assuming the answer. As a detective, we re-question witnesses all the time. Often it's to confirm something new or to clarify something that was glossed over in the original interview or even something that wasn't asked. So going back to interview a witness again is absolutely realistic, and we may do it multiple times. Honestly, we do it all the time, especially if we have a 6-pack of suspect photos we want them to take a look at. But just as Chuck probably guessed, that isn't the real question here. Every single scene in your story needs to be there for one singular reason: to push the story forward. If all you need is to drop a new fact in at a specific point in your timeline, you don't necessarily need to create an entire scene with dialogue between the protagonist and the witness. Ask yourself how a TV show would do it. And I say this because a TV show is a super compressed timeline. Only what's absolutely necessary to tell the story is going to be on screen. So if you know the detective can go back and ask more questions, but you also know that a scene like that is going to bog down your pace, is it possible for you to add a quick line of dialogue in a subsequent scene that covers it with a different character? I can totally imagine Bosch walking into Lieutenant Billet's office, breaking some big news on what they learned during an autopsy or at the crime lab, and then throwing in, oh, and I ran by the diner on my way back from the lab. Our witness, that waitress that was on that night, found the credit card receipt for our victim's dinner bill. She said he paid at 9:23 p.m. and left a few minutes after she ran the card. J. Edgar's booking the receipt into evidence right now. I mean, it's just like 3 sentences. You can get all the info you need into the story, even if it's just like paying a snippet of lip service to something rather than creating an entire scene around it. Every scene needs a reason. In fact, if you've read Blake Snyder's book, Save the Cat, which I highly, highly recommend, you'll know that every scene needs conflict and an emotional turn. If you can't figure out how or what would make that happen in that scene, it's a good indicator that you don't need it. But don't take my word for it. I'm just cheating off the smart kids. Seriously, if you have not read Save the Cat, make it your next book to read. I promise you will learn a ton about screenwriting and storytelling in general, and you will laugh. So Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, and I'll be sure to link to it in the show notes, which are at writersdetective.com/87. Thank you so much for listening this week. Stay home. Thanks for listening. Send me questions if you have them. You can send them to me at writersdetective.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week. Stay healthy and write well.